Good morning and welcome to The Art of Composition. Thanks for joining me today. Appreciate it as always. So today I thought I would look at a few Paul Hassell photographs. I haven't looked at his work lately because I've been busy. I'm back to work. And I discovered Paul, I want to say maybe a year and a half ago. Fell in love with his work. It's stunning. I have a lot of his images in my user's guide for a couple of reasons. One, it's exceptional. Two, a lot of it falls within the harmonic armature. So let me drop down the armature. But before I do that, I want to point out a few things about this photograph that's on my screen that I think is important. All right, the first thing is that I mentioned this before. If I find the central point of the composition, the pivot point, and I can do that by dropping a series of diagonal lines from corner to corner, and then just drive a horizontal and vertical line through that. There's your pivot point right in the center. Notice how the figure is standing on one side of the central point, the central division. And in order to balance this out, this photograph, this figure out on the other side, there's this element here. It's not as bright, it's not as contrasty, but it's enough to balance out this strong figure here on the opposite side from the central point. The other thing I want to point out is the gazing direction. Gazing direction is really important because it gives the viewer a visual path. There's two paths going on here. You have this from the child's eyes, the gazing direction from the child's eyes, and then back again from the dancer to the child. So it's going back and forth. So you're creating this back and forth movement between the main figure, the subject, the main subject, and the balancing element on the left-hand side. And also I want to point out that all of these divisions, the placement of this figure on the left, this is all determined by the armature. And then of course you have your dominant vertical here, but you also have this diagonal line being played out here in the arm as well. And then you have another shorter vertical at that point. And then you have this diagonal line here, which isn't as strong as this one and this one here, but it's still important. And what I'll do is I'll show how all of these divisions are being played out within the armature and how it makes it a successful photograph. And the other thing I want to mention too is that it's an interesting photograph. Just because something falls within an armature doesn't make it necessarily a work of art or interesting. The subject that you're photographing, it has to have viewer appeal. And I've seen a lot of photographs from those that study dynamic symmetry. They're basing their success on whether it fits in a grid. That's fine when it comes to design. But what I'm discovering is that the subject matter isn't very interesting. So you have to consider both of those elements when you're taking a photograph or creating a work of art. All right, here's the same photograph with the armature drawn down. And notice how those diagonal lines that I was just mentioning, and let me just draw that out here. I'll turn this to yellow so it actually stands out a little bit. I'll thicken the line. There you go. That diagonal line that I was talking about in the arm and the vertical, they're right here and they fall directly in line with the armature. Let me thin that up just a little bit. All right. Notice here too with the diagonal line at this point, it's traveling down that point of the leg, but also, of course, you've got these verticals running here. Now, as I said before, the child is being framed in with divisions that are running along these elements here. And then the head's being framed in at that point. So both of these figures are framed in. You also have that gazing direction I was talking about right here with the eyes, and it follows the angle of the armature. So you can use this armature in multiple ways, and of course you have the diagonal line of the nose being played out there. there's a lot going on. You also have this horizontal division right here. It's being played out around that point. You have a vertical running here. Try that again. That was not successful. There's a lot going on, but you can see how the artist, the photographer, can use the armature quite heavily in what looks like a simple photograph. I mean, if you look at it, it's not overly complex. It's not overly cluttered, so to speak. It's a simple photograph, but it's beautifully designed. It's an interesting idea. It's an interesting concept. All right, let me take a look at one more of Paul's images. All right, here's another one I found on his Instagram account. And as I was just talking about balance, because you have your figure leaning far to the left of the central point, and that would be right here, you have this light area in here of the figure. The dancer, her skin is quite pale, and it stands out against the darker values in the wall behind her. But notice that the door on the right balances out the leaning figure on the left, and because it's further from the central point, you need that balancing element over here in the dark door. And one thing you'll notice when you look at the armature, that the divisions of the door, you have a division here and then one here. They fall within the armature. And I believe there's a diagonal line running here off the armature as well that the dancer is leaning on. It's following the angle here in the arm, but also the angle here in the foot. And the subject is leaning on that diagonal line. And Juliet Aristides mentions this in Classical Painting, Atelier Chapter 2. The artist can use the diagonal lines to have their subjects land on those diagonal lines, but fit in the angle of the armature. And that's what's happening here. All right, so let me show you what the photograph looks like with the full armature on it. All right, let me convert this to yellow and do the same thing. So, that vertical I was talking about, it's being derived from these divisions here of the door. Let me thin that up just a notch. You have that diagonal line, which I had mentioned. The subject is leaning on that, but it also follows this. But also notice how this diagonal line is being played out here as well. You have a division here that frames in the subject at that point. You have a horizontal line running here, and then a vertical running at that point. Where this horizontal meets that diagonal line, I can drop that vertical, and now you've got your door framed in, and then it's also framed in, I believe, somewhere around here. And you also have verticals running through here that land within the door at that point. And you've got all of these are actually lining up. And this is what you can do. I mean, it's quite astounding, really, how much you can get to fall into place with the armature if you understand a few basics of how the armature works. This isn't rocket science. This isn't as complex as you would see in dynamic symmetry. And I just created a video talking about how dynamic symmetry, the way it's taught today, it's not going to take off the way it's taught today. We need a group of teachers that are willing to teach the basics of dynamic symmetry. Now, I don't want to get sidetracked here because I'm going to be doing another video on this, but I figured I would just bring it up anyway. The information that's out there on dynamic symmetry today, it's just too complex and nobody's getting it. It has to be retaught in a way that makes sense and in a way that isn't going to overwhelm those that are learning. And I have a lot of videos on that, and one book I talk about a lot is Mikhail Jacobs' book, A Simple Application of Dynamic Symmetry, for two reasons. One, it's the best book out there on the topic, and two, it's easy enough to understand, but I'll go into that in another video. on dynamic symmetry. Anyway, but I think this gives you a good idea of what you can do with the armature in a photograph and how important balance is in a design. But that's going to be it for today. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate it, as always.